Welcome, human geographers. We're going to talk about political geography. This chapter talks about a divided world, so political aspects can either have a boundary or not. They can have a theme and so forth. It gets really interesting. There's this idea of regions. Political geography, array of both formal and functional political regions. Most important influence is the state. State's a centralized authority and enforces a single political, economic, and legal system. Earth is divided roughly into 200 independent countries. One thing that's really interesting is the countries change fairly often. So if you look at like UN, United Nations membership, or you looked at World Health Organization and so forth, in general, there have been a lot of countries, states, if you will, that we just defined, that talk about their existence. For instance, Southern Sudan or South Sudan was formed pretty recently. Democratic Congo Republic, which I'm not sure it's either one of those, but Democratic or Republic. But it's in a very unstable part of the world, so we see countries form there as former Yugoslavia, former Lithuania, and so forth. So it is a dynamic thing. Independent countries of the world map was in rapid flux in the 20th century. Especially see quite a bit of that change post-World War II. Prior to World War I, we had Turkey dominating much of the region, and then we had things parsed out pretty well after split into many countries after World War II. Sovereignty, right of individual states to control political and economic affairs unto themselves without external influence. Territoriality, basically, what are your boundaries? What territory do you control? Nationalism, the concept of nation states. So a sense of belonging and self-identifying nationalism, put that together with the state boundaries and autonomous control we talked about, and you have a nation state. So here's the different types of political entities that we have. Nation states, no multinational immigrant states, varies quite a bit. So you can kind of see the countries to the left tend to be a little bit more freer, multi-ethnic than the countries to the east. National territory really kind of has spanned through history. We've had, especially 15th and 16th centuries, we had Europe expanding in every different direction, conquering territories. And we're from South America to North America to Africa to Australia to colonizing some of China. We've seen that pretty far-reaching. Enclave, piece of territory surrounded by but not part of a country. Exclave, territory separated from main body. Penenclave, intrusive piece of territory, smallest outlets. So best example we have kind of spans mostly South Asia, but we have a few samples that move around the world. So Russia for elongated, compact. We have France, Indonesia, fragmented, Brazil, compact, Lesotho, an enclave, and Chile, elongated. A couple samples from South America, some South Asia, and then Russia. Okay, Pakistan, example of national instability. So Pakistan borders India and also borders in the other far pretty close to Asia. Has a lot of influence. So national instability created in 47 is two bodies separated by 1,000 miles. West Pakistan held the capital. East Pakistan was home to most of the people. So you have a conflict right there. West Pakistan, where the capital is held most of the country's wealth. By the way, this is also the problem we saw with Russia's 74-year experiment. Most of the people in Moscow held the wealth, or near Moscow, and then the rest of the people were kind of left on their own. In 71, Pakistan broke apart. Enclaves succeeded, becoming Bangladesh. Satellite states, states on the tertiary. There's several samples of that: small, weak, natural flows, ethnographic, follows a cultural border, geometric, some specific shape. For instance, we see different countries' borders between like United States and Canada following a parallel. Also true with South and North Korea. And relic functionals as boundaries. Boundary can disappear. Unitary state and federal state concentrate power in the central government, France and China. Federal state, run by its constituent parts, United States and Australia. Centripetal force, basically brought in. Centrifugal is basically pushed out. So you can have those influences based on where you have state control. Territorial fission, so you can basically have split-offs or splinters. World's newest nation state, which I referred to before, South Sudan. Good example, territorial fission. Ethnic or linguist minority population secedes the state. So South Sudan seceded Sudan. War in Darfur, part of the Sudanese instability I was referring to earlier. Email, World Wide Web basically opens up boundaries in space. Supranational political boundaries, boundaries superseding country boundaries based on political, economic, or cultural interests. Here's samples of that, where you have several countries forming together. An example would be Arab League. Another one is the EU, European Union, ASEAN, Arab League. There's a bunch of other ones like APEC, OPEC. There's a bunch of them. EU, most powerful and ambitious, successful supranational organization. There has been the issue of Brexit, Britain leaving, and then the issues with Greece as far as essentially having some fiscal responsibility issues, which have really been turned around. And then you have the PIGS countries, Portugal, Italy, Greece we talked about, and Spain all having concerns in check. Why is it seen as being successful? Because it became the world's largest economy collectively. Gerrymandering, basically drawing borders to benefit certain types of groups or parties. We have that in this state, in the United States. In fact, the United States, the borders are drawn by the state governments. Red states, blue states. So we have Republicans being red and Democrats blue. Have different party platforms. Another example of that. And here another example. Last election. Core in the periphery, so nucleus, where an area grows. Commerce, cultural, sometimes it's a CBD. Peripheral areas, and this varies by countries quite a bit throughout the world, where you have secondary cities or basically growth spanning from the city. It really depends on a lot of what the practices are in the country in terms of cultural and agricultural, economic, so forth. Core area, we see some diffusion around Moscow. This basically speaks to the 74-year experiment I was referring to. Federal statutes, permit, laws adopted, so forth, has to do with a lot of politics. Governments are typically always working through issues almost as social engineers. Equal Rights Amendment, originally introduced in 1961. The main one passed was in 1964. Mobility as far as conflict, we saw quite a bit of refugees from Syria and instability around it. Refugee spaces, protracted refugee situation, basically when a lot of refugees are forced to move out, typically because of instability. Relocation diffusion, escalation diffusion, expansion diffusion, and so forth. Last, we have the nation state. So we talked about this before. UN was created in 1945, essentially self-deterministic to kind of make stability throughout the world. So we had a couple of really terrible world wars that draw in much of the world's population, where tens of millions of people died in each war. Then we have transnationality, going beyond nations. So think of this in terms of global efforts. Ethnic separatism. Think of this in terms of some of the horrific ethnic separations and genocides that have occurred. Cleavage models, just Persistent regional patterns in voting behavior coincides with core periphery divisions. Just sample this. You can see different types of voting, so forth. We have geopolitics or folk fortress, forests, outward facing escarpments, mountain ranges. Survival is often based on geopolitical situation before all the technology we have today. Okay, so let's talk about physical boundaries. So you can have physical boundaries that can help in terms of delineating where countries are. You can have impression of central authority. Central authority appears in many of the format or facets of the landscape. So it kind of becomes cultural. For instance, a country's symbol, national iconography, like certain colors. Think of this in terms of flags, different types of landscapes that you can have that a country's kind of known for. Anyway, interesting chapter. We could go on and on and on this in terms of governments and political geography, but I hope this provided pretty good insight of what's going on in the world, different things to look out for in the study in the class.